Right, hello everyone, today I want to talk a bit about some of the books that have helped me most go from 2000 FIDE to around where I am today at 2250 FIDE. And even if you're not in this rating range of say 2000 to 2250, I still believe you can get a lot out of this by just hearing me kind of talk about how these books helped me, like what gaps in my playthese filled. So without further ado, let's get right into it. And so the first book I want to talk about today is the book Grandmaster Preparation Positional Play by Jakob Aagaard by Quality Chess, the publisher. And this book was really a big game changer for me. As some of you may know, this book was part of the series Grandmaster Preparation, a book aimed at very ambitious players, but positional play is generally considered to be the easiest book in the series. And I've even heard players as low as like 1800 go through the book and found it pretty useful. But that being said, I went through this when I was around mid-2000 FIDE, and this book was really kind of a big milestone for me in the sense that it was the first real proper book that I'd seriously worked through. During my summer break, I had basically just worked through this book like every day, like an hour or so, and by the end of it, I went over to my first international tournament. Actually, I played in this tournament, Beal, and it was a very special tournament for me. I might talk about this another time, but essentially I had a very good performance there. I gained like 70 so rating points. I played another tournament where I gained a bit of a smaller amount, but overall after that summer break, I had jumped from like 2045 FIDE to like 2132 FIDE, which is almost 100 points, and for me that was sort of a really big break in my game after I'd been kind of plateaued around like 1900, 2000 FIDE for around a year or so. And so I just wanted to show an example from one of my games, actually in Beal this was, of how I believe this book really made an impact on my play. And also I should say that like one really important aspect of this book is it's not just like a bunch of theory being thrown at you. Here's how you use a bishop here, here's how you use a space advantage. Because at the end of the day, like that is useful to some extent, but it doesn't really teach you how to like make practical decisions over the board in a lot of quiet positions like this one we have on the board right now, for example. And essentially the whole backbone of the book is that it gives you these 3 questions to work with to find these sort of so-called simple decisions, right? Or make good moves in sort of simple positions. And basically these 3 questions are: what is your worst place piece? What are your opponent's weaknesses? And what is your opponent's idea? And basically in this position, what I was really looking at was what was my worst place piece? And also, what is my opponent's weakness? And I quickly came around to the idea that, okay, my worst place piece is probably this knight on e2. It doesn't really have much potential here. And I also see that my opponent, they might have some ideas to play in the king side, like, on the g file here, but it's not really anything too serious quite yet. And also my opponent has a weakness on the e5 square, so I took all that into account here, and I played this very interesting move, knight g1, essentially trying to play knight f3 and knight e5. And taking into account the fact that my opponent was playing the king side, yes, they could play a move like g4, but now this would close up the g file, and so I thought this would be like, okay, now I can't play this, but you also can't really play on the king side anymore. As it turns out, this wasn't completely accurate. G4 is apparently kind of good for black, but my opponent sort of bought into my idea here, and he played g takes f4, and we had a wild game eventually. I ended up getting my knight to e5 here. I had a pretty solid position, a bit of a slight advantage. I ended up losing the game, but it was very interesting, and I'm happy with how I played up until this point. And so the second book I want to talk about today is called Beyond Material by GM Dvoron Kalyasovic. And this was a really kind of inspiring book for me. I read it around the time I was like maybe high 2100, just 2200. And for me, the reason this book spoke to me was the fact that I had a lot of problems growing up with just giving up very small amounts of material, like a pawn, any sort of sacrifice I was like shit scared to make. And so this book I felt really helped me in a big way. And not only is it just like, oh, okay, yeah, kid, just go sacrifice material, go have fun. The book kind of really digs deep, and it's like, okay, here are some very common thought patterns that players often fall into, and you need to be aware of this because chances are you're also making this. And it also goes deep into how like very unsettling it can be sometimes for players to face these sacrifices, and really reminds you like, oh right, I'm not the only one scared to make the sacrifice. It might actually be my opponent who could be very taken aback by this. And furthermore, what I really liked about this book on top of that was that it's not just like sacrifice material, go have fun. It's also like, okay, but sometimes is sacrificing material actually the right choice? And it brings a lot of nuance into this discussion. There's a whole chapter on like being greedy and is that good, so I found that really interesting. And here's a game actually of mine that I personally played pretty soon after. I don't even think I read much of the book, but I had it on my shelf and I'd sort of looked through a bit of it, and this book really inspired me enough to make a very bold decision in this game. So essentially we have this very kind of sharp position which we got from the Caro-Kann, and here I just played c5, gaining space in the center, and my opponent just played a4 in this position, and I went into the tank here for a long time because I realized I don't really want to allow a5 for my opponent kicking my knight away from this b6 square. And if I played a move like a5 for example, now this would create some chronic weaknesses in my position like this b5 square. This a5 pawn is also a bit problematic, so I didn't really like this. But at the same time, if I were to just play a sort of natural developing move like rook c8, now a5 and my knight's forced back to a8, while I can play g4, gain the initiative like this, and sort of build up slowly from here and have some sort of potential kingside attacking chances with f5 maybe, and I just wasn't really down for all of it. So with all this in mind, this really just pushed me to realize, okay, it's like either my opponent plays a5, kicks my knight away and just strangles me to death, positionally, and also just kills me on the king side, or I take immediate action and really just try to change the nature of the position, which I did with move d4 here, creating the space for the knight on d5 here. And now after some further moves here, I end up gaining a lot of compensation. For example, this position was really nice for me. This really just shows complete domination on the light squares here. Sure, I'm down a pawn, but you can really just see from this position here that I have the bishop here. You know, this bishop is pretty bad. This pawn's blockaded. My pieces are very active. Like, this position is pretty freaking good for black here. And I did go on to win the game from here. Alright, so the final book I want to talk about today is this book called Chess Calculation Training Middle Game by French Grandmaster GM Romain Edouard. And this book really helped me in a big way because, like the sort of material thing, giving that up, another thing I really struggled with in my game was just calculating clearly. I had a lot of trouble visualizing positions, calculating lines. I'd often be all over the place. My thoughts just were not structured. And this book I felt really helped me. And the thing I really liked about this book was how the chapters were structured, because a lot of books will be like, okay, this chapter's on candidate moves, this move is on, you know, the process of elimination, all these sort of like calculation techniques. And I'm not necessarily saying that's bad per se, but I did like how this book did it, where it's like, okay, in this chapter we're going to be focusing on how can you punish the bad coordination of your pieces. And themes like that I found to be a lot more applicable and really spoke to me more than the whole like thing like, okay, you need to find candidate moves and this is how you're going to try and go about solving this problem. It felt a lot more robotic to me, and I really felt this to be more natural in a sense. And when I worked through this, I was around like 2180 FIDE, and after working on this pretty much daily for like, once again during another summer break, my next tournament I had another big breakthrough, and I, for the first time really, broke through the 2200 barrier, like really just broke through that to around 2250 FIDE today, which is where I'm standing at around now. Unfortunately, I haven't really been able to play too much chess since then, so my ratings kind of stayed around the same, but this book really was a big help for me. And so this is an example I want to show from one of my own games. It was actually against a much lower rated player. This guy's around like 1600, 1700 FIDE, I think. But still, I'm like, you know, I'm up a pawn. I have a much better position. The engine's screaming like +6, +5, you know, whatever I do pretty much. But I really wanted to put away my opponent very quickly and do so in the most efficient manner here. And to be honest, if I hadn't done that work I had in the summer, I feel like I might have struggled around a bit, not really played the most accurate way, but because I had done so, I was able to finish the game off in a very nice manner here by playing c5. And after d takes c5, rook takes e6 is a very natural move, but after some like queen g5 stuff, I couldn't exactly find a killer blow. As it turns out, my calculation maybe wasn't as good as I thought it was, because I have like rook f6 check here, for example, and if the king takes it, there's queen e6 mate. But I calculated this whole line here with after d takes c5, knight takes e6, and even though like this is also winning, maybe it's not as clear cut as rook takes e6 arguably, but I calculated a very forced line which I was quite proud of. And it was basically after c4 here, which cuts off the queen, and a lot of people might just stop here being like, oh, okay, this isn't so good. Because I'd done that training, I kind of knew that like, okay, maybe if I push further, there will kind of be some diamonds at the end of the tunnel here. And I looked further with queen c3, and I saw rook c6, and again, some people might kind of be like, okay, if queen takes g7, king takes e6, yeah, maybe we're sort of doing well after something like this, but this isn't exactly what we want, right? But I looked deeper than that once again, and I was like, okay, maybe not this immediately, but now this knight's actually kind of a bit sort of loose because this rook has moved here. So what if I just take this? And I calculated and I was like, okay, yeah, actually if they take this, I get queen takes g7, and now I win the queen. This is just an absolutely decisive advantage. And so what happened in the game was, after all these forced moves, my opponent played this, and I just essentially ended up rook up, where my opponent for some reason did not resign, but you know, it is what it is. I won the game from here without too much effort. And yeah, this was just a really simple example of how I felt this book benefited me, just making my calculation a lot more clear. And also something I wanted to touch upon was that in this tournament that I actually did manage to win, a big component of this was my calculation, but it wasn't exactly in the sort of way you would expect it to be. Like, I wasn't getting all these sharp positions where I was calculating like 20 moves deep. It was more just that, like, because my calculation was on point, I was able to really bring that out at any moment that I needed to. And what I mean is that, like, throughout a game, a lot of the times, the really important calculations are the ones that don't really stick out. It's like, there might be some 1 or 2 move line where you just have to calculate like 1 move deep and see a certain resource, and if you miss that, you might end up playing another move and rejecting the move that otherwise would have been very strong. And that's why I found in this tournament, where just because my calculation was so sharp, I was able to make a lot of good positional decisions backed up by that calculation. And I feel like that's what really contributed to my success in this tournament. And as an honorable mention, I also want to go over one opening book that I found to be very useful for me during this time period. And I think I read this around 2017. I was around like mid-1900 FIDE at the time, and it was playing 1d4 d5 by Nikos Naturalis, a very good author from Quality Chess. And this book was, I think it's probably still my favorite opening book to this day. And the reason this book really spoke to me was because at the time I just struggled against 1d4. I was sort of a Nimzo Indian player, and against Knight f3 I'd also play the Bogo Indian, but to be honest, my results over the board were pretty dismal, and it was kind of depressing. Not to mention, but against like 1c4 and Knight f3 stuff, the whole repertoire I was playing just wasn't that great, to be honest. Like in this position here, the best move is by far to play d5, but if you're a Bogo Indian player, you can't really play d5 because then you're going to be out of book after d4. And if you play something like bishop b4, queen c2, in my opinion, this is just a much worse version of the typical Nimzo Indian positions you get, and it's just not very fun to play. And on top of that, this book, what it really did was it opened my mind to the fact that I was very close-minded about a lot of openings, and I didn't really realize that. For example, one thing I'd assumed very often was that these positions in the Queen's Gambit Decline Exchange variation, which is recommended by virtually almost like every white repertoire on 1d4 out there, I sort of was conditioned to believe that this was just very passive for black, not much fun. Whereas this book kind of changed my mind now a little bit. It recommended these whole lines where you go h6, knight h5, and this actually is quite solid for black, and through practice I learned that and managed to rack up some pretty good results. So that was a really sort of big game changer for me at the time. And for example, I'll just show one sort of cool idea which I really had no idea of before, which was that white can castle queenside here, and instead of black castling kingside, which is sort of run into this sort of opposite side castling clash here, a much more solid option is just to wait here and then castle long as well. And here there's a lot of sort of interesting stuff going on. Black is pretty solid though, and like this whole like long castles idea, I just didn't even know this sort of thing existed in the Queen's Gambit Decline. So like this book, once again, it really opened me up to a lot of possibilities which I just simply was not aware of. Alright, so that just about wraps up today's video. I hope you guys found this useful. I'm going to leave links in the description below to the books. If you're interested, please check those out. With that being said, I hope you guys found this useful. As always, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, all that stuff. Leave a comment down below if there's anything you want me to cover in the future, any book reviews or anything like that. But I hope you guys all have a good day, and I'll see you until next time.